The Counter Extremism Project is proud of the research and advocacy work it has already done to combat anti-Semitism. We plan to increase our effort and launch new initiatives in this vital area. I grew up not so long after the end of the Second World War, at a time when memories of the Holocaust were fresh and anti-Semitism was despised. Those who indulged in it seemed to be a marginalized, shamefaced minority. Later, serving as an Arabic-speaking British diplomat in a series of Middle Eastern postings, I was horrified to learn how widespread and mainstream hatred of Jews, as well as Israel, was in that part of the world. But the Hamas atrocities against Israel on October the 7th last year not only exemplified that hatred, they also seem to have inspired and emboldened a level and extent of anti-Semitism that I had not believed still to exist in the West. As I said, CEP was already active in this field. The two most ubiquitous common features of extremist groups of all kinds, jihadists, neo-Nazis, left-wing extremists, turns out to be misogyny and anti-Semitism, hatred of women and Jews. Again, it is galling to discover that women's rights and equality, which are grounded in common sense, human rights, efficiency, equity, and natural justice, should also now be subject to a challenge from extremists and terrorists that is gaining political traction. One problem turns out to have been complacency, that I and people like me believed these battles to have been fought and won for all time. But you can never afford to be complacent about hard-won rights. Unlike in the 1970s, many Westerners in the 2020s have forgotten the Holocaust, as well as the struggle for female emancipation. It is malign actors, extremists and terrorists, who have never stopped working for evil purposes. There has been a debasement of language too. People speaking in hyperbole, misusing and overusing words like genocide. The Holocaust was the genocide, with a few other candidates like the Armenian and Tutsi massacres also discussed in those terms. Its use in the case of the current Gaza crisis is laughably inaccurate, but the effect can be deadly serious. If the Holocaust is just another genocide and Israel is accused of behaving like the Nazis, all perspective is lost. And this is precisely the intent of Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis, and their useful idiot friends in the West. Hamas and the Axis of Resistance have serious genocidal intent against Israel, while the Houthis' motto, or scream, threatens death to Israel and a curse upon the Jews. Somehow, Western and UN diplomacy overlooks this, whereas it is an outrage that should be a bar to treating these groups as potential partners for dialogue, as it would be if they spoke in those terms about Muslims or Africans. One reason why Qatar, Iran, and others take such an interest in the Western academic sector is to buy influence, impose unsuitable academic appointments, and lend a veneer of intellectual respectability to their agenda. If professors spout anti-Semitism, surely it can't be anti-Semitism. But it is. So what can we do about it? First of all, we must insist on the universal application of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. This is not intended to stifle legitimate criticism of the government of Israel. But attacking Jews' right to safety in the state of Israel is implicitly genocidal. They have been persecuted and murdered almost everywhere else, and especially in Arab countries, where they used to have thriving communities, but where hardly any now dare or are allowed to remain. And reading the IHRA definition, who can fail to see the resonance as demonstrations about Gaza have in fact targeted Jews rather than Israel? Quote, "Antisemitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of antisemitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities," end quote. Second point of action, the United Nations outside the Security Council has to be called out for its habitual bias against the State of Israel, which has been tediously and relentlessly targeted in resolutions. Even when there is some vestige of legitimacy to the criticism, most of the critics in the UN are more guilty of more extreme abuses, but are never targeted. And the first target of this action against the UN should be the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, UNRWA. This special mandate has long outstayed its relevance and been infiltrated and exploited by Hamas. All Western nations and allies should defund and insist on the abolition of UNRWA. Third, all Iranian, Qatari, and other anti-Western infiltration of Western academia needs to be rolled back. These countries are not interested in honest intellectual inquiry. They are buying influence, seeking technology transfer, and introducing fifth columnists onto our university campuses. Texas A&M University has closed its Doha campus in response to these concerns. That is just one small victory. Many more such are needed. Fourthly and finally, we need to be clearer about who our enemies are. If you are a Western liberal or conservative with a small L or C, and by the way, most of us are both, when someone hates Jews for being Jews or believes that women should have fewer rights than men, they are your enemies. If someone sides with Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, they are your enemies. You should be siding, not uncritically, but resolutely, with NATO, with Ukraine, and with Israel. Our freedom was hard won in the West, and it is underpinned by committed military and intelligence alliances. We should not abandon our allies. Their enemies will never be our allies, and we will just weaken ourselves for when those enemies turn their attention to us. Those enemies are characterized by hatred of Jews and the West and Western values. That is evidence enough of their hostility and of the need to defeat them.